Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Happy 2021, everyone. It's the beginning of a new year, and normally that would mean a flurry of ambitious new projects, goals, and plans to achieve them both. But 10 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us are hesitant to begin new things right now, especially given the degree of uncertainty that's shaping our world and our daily lives. My guest today is sexuality and public health scholar Chris Barcelos. Chris uses José Esteban Muñoz's concept of educated hope to illustrate how we can begin activist, artistic, and academic projects now that feed our long-term vision for a better world, even in the middle of a global pandemic. In our conversation, Chris and I chat about pivoting socially engaged research to fit new circumstances, creative ways to launch a book during a pandemic, the reason why it's so important to foreground reproductive justice in public health campaigns, and why beginning with access intimacy and critical messiness is how Chris imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're kicking off this year by focusing on beginnings, or the process of starting projects given our current rather tumultuous world. I'm curious, how are you approaching new beginnings this year in particular?
Well, it's hard to focus on new beginnings right now because it feels like the 500th day of March 2020. Our sense of time has really been disrupted by the pandemic and then, watching insurrection at the U.S. Capitol while I'm conducting research interviews, right? So it's just like the whole sense of time has really been upended for me and I think a lot of people. And then personally, I've had this weird time, new beginnings thing where I moved across the country during the pandemic to start a new job at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And so I'm back in New England where I'm from and in a city I've been trying to move back to for a really long time. So that is a new beginning. That's this great big triumph. But then at the same time, I'm doing these new beginnings in a new place, mostly over Zoom, right? So, and I work in a particular way that's a little different than a lot of academics, which is that I'm not wedded to a particular topic or community or time period or something like that. My research agenda and my projects are really grounded in the communities that I'm a part of or that I'm in solidarity with. So moving to a new place, normally I would be having a lot of coffee dates and doing a lot of networking and seeing what organizations and what groups are doing the kind of transformative pedagogy and research and stuff that I'm interested in. And then that would kind of lead the new beginnings of what my newer research projects would be. So as you can imagine, that's very challenging to do remotely. And so the new beginnings I've been trying to foster have been, of course, remote. So having a lot of Zoom dates with people, doing volunteer work remotely, spending a lot of time researching people and projects on social media. So I don't really know where that's going to take me. And I think that there's so much we don't know about what the world is going to look like in a few months or a year. And so I'm trying to focus on the fact that as an ethnographer, that's both terrifying and also really exciting, right? Because there can be some really exciting new beginnings that hopefully can emerge from the ashes of whatever is going to happen in the next however long.
I'm finding that one of the things that I'm personally trying to do right now, not always successfully, but trying, is keeping that act of beginning separate from planning. Because my immediate knee-jerk reaction is planning. I love planning. It's super fun. But planning is also very challenging right now, right? Especially in a long-term sense. And so I'm finding that focusing on those kind of small acts of beginning, those first few steps, even though we're not quite sure where they may take us, somehow feels a bit more manageable and doesn't mean that we have to unravel this incredibly elaborate, lovely plan that is going to be out of date a week from now. Anyway,
Yep.
Are you finding yourself doing something similar or kind of keeping beginning versus planning separate in your projects right now?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is relevant to that is this project I had been working on for quite a while. It's called the Trans Youth Justice Project, and it started when a community organization had a need to do this leadership development project for trans youth, and then ended up at a different nonprofit, and we had started it. We began it last February, and then we all know what happened. And then I tried to, I was pretty bummed, as many of us were at that time, I think, with when our projects got upended by the crisis. But I tried to use it as an opportunity to begin again and begin it in a new way. And we obviously had not planned for that, right? So we started it again in the fall of 2020 as a remote program. And even though at first I was pretty resistant to doing that, right? It was not what I had planned to do. As an educator, I think there's a lot of value in being in a space with people, right? And so it was actually really transformative in a lot of ways that we had young people from all over the U.S. who were participating. A lot of them were, had never met other trans people in real life, and definitely not trans grown-ups. And so we were able to create this new thing out of this kind of crisis situation. And, I also had planned that, like, okay, this is going to be the project, and we're going to do the program evaluation, and we're going to make this curriculum and release it online, and that will be that. And then just in the last few weeks, we kind of realized that, like, we actually should do this again, not only because there's such a need, but because there's a lot of room for us to improve it and to grow. So we are going to begin again in the new year with a new cohort of young people. So that's exciting and not something I planned for, but feels really good to be grounded in this particular project and building community with people, of course, over Zoom. So.
I know something else that, in the terms of beginnings, that you're doing right now is you're kicking off a book launch for a really fantastic new book that you have that came out recently called "Distributing Condoms and Hope: The Racialized Politics of Youth Sexual Health." And maybe I want to talk about the kind of process of launching that book in this context, but maybe for folks who don't already have a copy or aren't already familiar with it, can you maybe just give a little bit of an overview of what's that book all about?
Sure. So the book is about a lot of things, and it's really promiscuous in that sense. So I think of myself as very disciplinarily promiscuous, right? And the book is about a lot of things. So at its very core, it's an ethnographic analysis of youth sexual health promotion efforts in this particular city that's synonymous in the book. That was really well known for having high rates of teen pregnancy among economically marginalized Latinas. So that's kind of what the ethnography is about. But it's also really about how race and power move through community-based public health work. It's about including pregnant and parenting youth in a reproductive justice framework, vision, social movement. And I also like to point out, especially because I think a lot of folks are more familiar with my work in queer and trans studies, I like to point out that the book kind of has a little bit of something for everybody. So there's activist critiques of the nonprofit industrial complex. There's a chapter elaborating what queer of color critique teaches us about teen moms and teaches us about thinking what a coalition-based politics of sexual others really looks like. There's stuff thinking through how we understand risk in science, which is very timely. And then methodologically, I think there's a lot about thinking about the challenges, but also the richness and importance of doing, quote unquote, what's called insider-outsider ethnography. And there's also a Beyonce reference that I'm really proud of, and pretty much everyone likes Beyonce. So,
Good call. One of the things that I really love about this is you close out this book. I mean, it's throughout, but you really kind of hone in on it at the very end. You hone in on this concept of educated hope, which I know you draw from José Esteban Muñoz and kind of expand in the context of your ethnographic work. And I'm going to quote you for a minute here. Try not to be embarrassed. You write that, quote, "Educated hope is a mode of critique that works toward a utopic vision without eliding the messiness of the path toward that vision. The means are just as important as the ends," end quote. Yeah. And I find that really powerful and really important in our world right now. And I'm curious how that practice of educated hope shapes the way that you approach public health and pedagogy, both in the context of your work on this book, but also more broadly?
Yeah, I thank you for pulling out that quote. And I think that's a good example of the kind of promiscuous methodologies that I use, right? So we don't often see Muñoz quoted in a book about community-based public health or teen moms, right? So that quote really for me speaks to this thing that I say to my students a lot, which is that we have to learn to critique the thing while doing the thing. So, a lot of us that are educators in women, gender, and sexuality studies or critical race and ethnic studies. So like those of us who are working with students who are, learning all these tools of critique, and then also are like, wait, now I'm just going to be thrown into like the nonprofit world. And you've spent 4 years teaching me how this is like a tool of racial capitalism and the patriarchy, right? And now I kind of have to work within it, right? And how am I going to change the world, given what I know about the nonprofit industrial complex, right? So what I'm always talking about is like, we have to learn to critique the thing while also navigating it, right? So like personally, I would love to see a world in which we, abolish capitalism. And in the meantime, I work for a wage, right, at a university because, I have to learn to critique the thing while also navigating my way through the limitations that capitalism imposes on us, right? So I think there's also a lot to learn here from scholars and activists who write about the prison industrial complex and abolitionism, and thinking about how we keep a long-term vision in place while also working to make lives as livable or survivable as we can in the meanwhile, right? So like the work that we do in the time between now and our liberation, right? What does that look like? And so that's kind of what I mean by the means are just as important as the ends. So thinking about the politics of how we get there, whatever the there is. So in public health work, there's a lot of focus on a particular end goal, right? So we want to decrease rates of blank, right? But there isn't always an analysis around, do the means justify the end, right? Or vice versa. So if in the book, for example, the goal is really like reduce the teen birth rate, but often at the expense of like vilifying pregnant and parenting teens, right? Who are then used as failures and warning signs for other young people to, use a condom or get on contraception or whatever. So it's the opposite of a reproductive justice vision. And then there's a similar thing, thinking about abolition, right? So like you have to kind of get the cop out of your own head, right? So you don't, for example, go to a Black Lives Matter event and then go home and call the cops on like the drunk guy on your corner. It means, right, like not immediately canceling members of our own community when we mess up, right? So keeping that long-term vision and not, forgetting the messy path that it takes us to get there, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And it's harder, right? Like it's so much harder than some of the more simplistic versions. But as you point out, if we are committed to truly imagining otherwise, to truly creating that kind of reproductive justice, social justice, economic justice, racial justice future, it needs to be created in the present as well, right?
And it's messy, right? And you can tell in the book, I'm really interested in messiness. And this liberation work is messy work, right? Intellectual work is messy work. And we need to sit with that mess rather than running from it, right?
So I mentioned a couple minutes ago that you're launching this book, possibly in a context that you didn't anticipate launching it in, which is a global pandemic, of course. And this is something that I've been talking on the show a lot with several guests about kind of the challenges of launching a book in this context and doing a virtual book tour. But I'm also finding that people are coming up with some wildly, fantastically interesting and creative practices to do so. So I'm curious, how are you approaching this kind of virtual book launch, or what are maybe some of the priorities that you're keeping in mind as you're planning out how to get the word out about this book?
Yes, great question. It is really hard, and I would love to know what are the other wild and crazy things that people have thought of. Because I was really looking forward, to this vision I'd had for years of launching my book in my favorite indie bookstore with a cake that has like a screen print icing of the book's cover, right? And so, like everything else, I'm still gonna get the cake, but it's gonna happen at home in sweatpants, as everything does these days. But the benefit is that I will get to eat all the cake, I guess. So
that is true.
So I'm planning a virtual book launch that's going to be in April, and that's going to be with some of the authors and editors from the University of California Reproductive Justice Series, which my book is part of. And then hopefully in the fall, I'm imagining a world, hopefully tentatively, in which we could maybe be gathering in person in Boston with my new colleagues. And I really hope that the virtual book launch thing is a thing we keep from this crisis, along with a lot of other sort of virtual events, because I've been able to engage with folks and their work that I would never have been able to go to because they were in other parts of the country or, all of the busy things that we're doing in our lives. So I hope that the virtual book launch thing continues to be a thing alongside the being in person in your bookstore thing with other people.
I agree. I want that to stick around. I think that has a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think a lot of, I want to come back to this also in some of the other questions you have, but also it's also about access in a way that I really want us to keep from this crisis, right? So I've been sort of reflecting on like how many burlesque and drag shows I've been to in the last 10 months because they were on Zoom, and I went, attended them not in a bar where there's all kinds of weird, racism and, transphobia and all that stuff, right? But just kind of in my living room. And I think there's a lot in academia that's very similar, right? Anyway, so I'm planning to do some more podcasts and kind of writing some blog posts and think pieces, particularly around what the book can teach us about our current moment. And so that's one of my priorities too, is to harness the pedagogical value of the book. And though its focus is on reproductive justice and youth sexuality, I think that the book has a lot to teach us about two of the kind of recent things that we're working with in the world. So over the summer, among all of the uprisings following the police murder of George Floyd, we saw a lot of calls to abolish the police, which is something I wholeheartedly support. But there was also this narrative of like, let's abolish the police and replace the police with, social workers and public health professionals, right? There was even an article like in kind of mainstreamy news outlets like the New York Times around this. And so the book really teaches us, that there's a big danger in that, right? That these professions are not immune from white supremacy and settler colonialism, and we're in many ways built on them, right? So, abolishing the police and then replacing them with professions where it's predominantly white cisgender women in sort of helping relationships with communities they're not a part of is really dangerous, right? So, at the same time that we're sort of thinking about how to dismantle the police, I think the book also shows us that we also have to think about how we dismantle racism in the helping professions, while centering community control and autonomy and that sort of thing. The other thing I'll say I'm thinking about the book and its launch about our current moment is what the book has to teach us about the COVID crisis. And three things I've been thinking a lot about. The first is that shame doesn't work. So in the book, there's a lot of shaming young people into making particular sexual or reproductive choices, right? Like you don't want to end up like one of those bad girls who's pregnant, right? And we're seeing a kind of similar thing of like, if we just shame people into social distancing, as if that's going to work. And we know that doesn't work, right? Like shame is not a great motivator of people changing their behavior, right? And it's also problematic, right? And then the other thing I'm seeing is that there is in the initiative to roll out a vaccine, I'm seeing a lot of kind of like, well, Black and brown folks just need to get over the histories of racist mistreatment at the hands of medicine and public health, right? Like, just get over it. We know it's like that was in the past, which is just not how that works, right? It's putting the onus on marginalized people to get over our injustices at the hands of people in medicine and public health, right? Which is a similar thing that happens in the book of like, well, we're just going to kind of, we acknowledge that contraceptive coercion has been a thing in the past, but that's over, and now we're here to help you, sort of thing. And then the other thing I've been thinking about in terms of the book and launching it in the COVID crisis is actually the quote that you pulled from the conclusion, right? That it's, it might seem like foolish or impractical to be imagining this new world in this moment when everything is just a disaster, right? And everything seems broken. But I think we can also think of that as a moment that we have all the space to rebuild, right? So I was just talking about access intimacy, right? And like having this deep knowledge of the things that people need to fully participate in the world, right? So whether that's like virtual book launches and drag shows on Zoom, or even just like, meetings on Zoom and understanding people's access needs, right? So I think the book also helps us think about when everything seems broken, what can we build from it?
So this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise. And my final question that I love talking with folks about really gets at that big why behind all of the kinds of projects that you do. And so I'll ask you this giant question that I think is also an important one of what's the kind of world that you're working toward? What kind of world do you want?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'll say two things. And one is really related to public health work and the way that public health professionals often frame their work as what they're trying to prevent and not what they're trying to promote, right? So preventing teen pregnancy, but not necessarily promoting reproductive justice. And in the current COVID crisis, we're trying to prevent transmission of this infectious disease, but are we also promoting racial justice, promoting access, intimacy, and so on? So like I write in the book, I want to imagine a world in which, say, structural racism replaces preventing teen pregnancy as an urgent social problem that service providers, quote, hold close to their heart, which is a thing people would say. The other thing I want to think about and to imagine is to work to this world in which we really embody the coalitional politics that Cathy Cohen lays out in her famous essay on punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens. So a vision in which our collective liberation is really bound up in each other's and nobody is left behind.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thanks, Cathy.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by me, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.